The Bloodstained Uniform. St. Mary's Hospital was a bustling institution, a place where life was fought for and sometimes lost. The building was a maze of white-walled corridors and sterile rooms, filled with the constant hum of activity. Nurses and doctors hurried back and forth, their footsteps echoing against the cold tiles. Among them was Emily, a young nurse known for her dedication and skill. Clad in her crisp, white uniform, she moved through the halls with a calm efficiency that belied the turmoil within her. For Emily was not like the others. Beneath her professional facade, she battled a condition that few knew about: adenomyosis, a painful and debilitating disorder. For years, she had managed to keep her condition a secret, pushing through the pain with sheer willpower. But the strain was beginning to show, and as the days wore on, Emily found herself fighting a battle she could no longer win alone. Emily's day began in the early hours of the morning. Long before the sun rose, the darkness outside mirrored the heaviness she felt within. Each movement was a challenge, as the pain that had become her constant companion flared up with the slightest provocation. Her abdomen throbbed with a deep, searing pain, and she could feel the tightness in her muscles as she forced herself out of bed. She went through her morning routine with mechanical precision. The hot shower did little to ease the ache in her body, and the small breakfast she managed to swallow seemed to turn to lead in her stomach. Dressing in her white uniform was the final step, a ritual that she performed with great care. The uniform was a symbol of her role, a barrier between her private suffering and the demands of her job. It had to be perfect. As Emily arrived at St. Mary's, the familiar sights and sounds of the hospital greeted her: the blinding fluorescent lights, the antiseptic smell, the beeping of machines, all were part of her daily life. But today, they felt overwhelming, as if the very building was pressing down on her. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, pushing the discomfort aside. The hours stretched on endlessly as she moved from one task to another, administering medications, checking vitals, comforting patients. These were the things that had once brought her satisfaction, but now, they felt like an unbearable burden. The pain in her abdomen was growing worse, and she could feel it pulling at her, draining her energy. Every step was an effort, every smile a mask. There were moments when the room would spin, and she would have to grip the edge of a counter or a bed to steady herself. Her hands shook as she held a syringe, the needle wobbling dangerously close to a patient's skin. She would blink rapidly, trying to clear her vision, and force herself to continue. No one could know what she was going through. She wouldn't allow it. For Emily, the worst part of her condition wasn't the physical pain, but the isolation it caused. She was surrounded by people every day, colleagues, patients, even strangers in the hallways, but none of them knew the truth. None of them understood the battle she was fighting. She had become adept at hiding her pain, but it was becoming harder with each passing day. There were times when the pain was so intense that she had to excuse herself, retreating to the privacy of a bathroom stall to compose herself. She would lock the door, press her back against the cold tile, and bite her lip to keep from crying out. The cramps twisted through her abdomen like a vice, squeezing until she could barely breathe. She would count the seconds, waiting for the wave to pass, and then straighten her uniform, wipe away the tears, and return to work as if nothing had happened. At home, it was no different. She lived alone in a small apartment not far from the hospital, a place that had once been a sanctuary but now felt more like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the silence was deafening. The pain was always there, a constant reminder that she was never truly alone. It haunted her even in her sleep, turning her dreams into nightmares. Emily had always been a private person, and her condition only reinforced that tendency. She didn't want to burden anyone with her problems, didn't want to be seen as weak or incapable, so she kept it to herself, suffering in silence. But the strain was beginning to take its toll. She was exhausted all the time, her body worn down by the constant pain and lack of sleep. Her once vibrant spirit was fading, replaced by a numbness that scared her more than anything. As the weeks went by, Emily's symptoms grew worse. The pain, once a dull ache, was now a sharp, stabbing sensation that left her doubled over in agony. Her periods became increasingly heavy, the bleeding so severe that she had to change her pads every hour. But it wasn't just the physical symptoms that alarmed her. It was the feeling that something was very wrong. She noticed other changes as well. Her energy levels plummeted, and she found herself struggling to keep up with her workload. Simple tasks that she had once performed with ease now left her breathless and shaking. She was losing weight rapidly, her clothes hanging loose on her frame. Her skin, once healthy and glowing, was now pale and clammy, with dark circles under her eyes. But the most troubling symptom was the bleeding. It had always been heavy, but now it was becoming uncontrollable. There were times when she would feel a sudden gush of blood, soaking through her clothes in seconds. She would have to excuse herself, rushing to the bathroom to clean up and change, praying that no one would notice. But she couldn't keep up with it. No matter how many precautions she took, the blood always seemed to find a way through. Emily knew she needed to see a doctor, to get help before things got worse, but she kept putting it off, telling herself that she could handle it. She didn't want to admit that she was struggling, didn't want to face the possibility that her condition was worsening, so she pushed through the pain, determined to keep going no matter what. It was a particularly busy Friday evening when everything came to a head. The hospital was bustling with activity, the ER filled to capacity with patients. Emily had been on her feet for hours, running from one task to the next without a moment to rest. The adrenaline kept her going, masking the pain that had been building in her abdomen all day. But as the night wore on, the adrenaline began to wear off, and the pain returned with a vengeance. Emily could feel it spreading through her body, a deep, pulsating ache that made it difficult to focus. She tried to push through it, telling herself that she just needed to make it a few more hours, but the pain was relentless. By midnight, Emily was struggling to stay on her feet. Her hands shook as she attempted to administer an injection to a patient, the needle slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. She apologized profusely, her voice trembling as she picked up the needle and tried again. But the patient, a middle-aged woman with a gentle smile, reached out and touched Emily's arm. "Honey, are you okay?" the woman asked, her voice filled with concern. "You look like you're about to faint." Emily forced a smile, nodding as she finished the injection. "I'm fine," she replied, though the words felt hollow. "Just a little tired, that's all." But as she walked away, the truth hit her like a ton of bricks. She wasn't fine. She was far from it. The pain was becoming unbearable, and she knew she couldn't keep going like this. She needed help, and she needed it now. Emily stumbled into the staff bathroom, her vision beginning to blur as the pain intensified. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat sending a jolt of agony through her abdomen. By the time she reached the bathroom, she was barely able to stand, her legs shaking as she leaned against the sink for support. She looked at herself in the mirror, horrified by what she saw. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, with dark circles under her eyes. Her uniform, once pristine and white, was now stained with blood, the red spreading across her abdomen like an ink blot. Emily's hands trembled as she lifted the hem of her shirt, revealing the full extent of the bleeding. It was worse than she had thought, much worse. Panic set in as she realized she couldn't handle this on her own. She needed to get to the hospital, needed to find someone who could help her, but the thought of admitting her weakness, of asking for help, filled her with dread. She didn't want to be seen as a burden, didn't want to let anyone down. But as another wave of pain hit her, doubling her over, she knew she had no choice. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers slick with blood as she dialed her boyfriend's number. He picked up on the first ring, his voice filled with concern as he heard her labored breathing. "Emily, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. "I need help," Emily gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, call 112. "I can't." Her voice trailed off as another wave of pain hit her, and she dropped the phone, clutching her abdomen as she collapsed to the floor. She could hear her boyfriend's frantic voice on the other end of the line, but she couldn't respond. The pain was too much, overwhelming her senses until all she could do was scream. The paramedics arrived within minutes, bursting through the bathroom door to find Emily curled up on the floor, her uniform soaked in blood. They worked quickly, lifting her onto a stretcher and rushing her to the ER, but even as they administered painkillers and attempted to stabilize her, Emily could feel herself slipping away. The world around her began to blur, the bright lights of the hospital fading into darkness. She could hear the voices of the doctors and nurses, but they sounded distant, like echoes from another world. She was barely aware of the needle sliding into her arm, the cool sensation of the fluid as it flowed into her veins. She was aware of one thing though, the blood. It was everywhere, soaking through the sheets, pooling on the floor. No matter how much they tried to stop it, it kept coming, a relentless tide that threatened to drown her. And with the blood came the pain, a searing, burning sensation that consumed her entire body. Emily's thoughts began to fragment, her mind drifting in and out of consciousness. She saw flashes of her life, memories that flitted by like the pages of a book. Her childhood, her time in nursing school, her first day at St. Mary's, they all played out before her like a movie. But the memories were tainted by the pain, twisted into something dark and nightmarish. And then there were the voices. They started as whispers, barely audible above the hum of the machines. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they filled her head, drowning out everything else. They were angry, accusing, telling her that she was weak, that she had failed. She tried to shut them out, but they kept coming, relentless and unforgiving. As the hours dragged on, Emily's condition worsened. The bleeding showed no signs of stopping, and her vital signs were dangerously unstable. The doctors worked frantically to save her, but it was clear that they were fighting a losing battle. But even as her body began to shut down, Emily's mind was trapped in a nightmare. The voices that had haunted her earlier were now screaming, their words twisting into something monstrous. She could see shadows moving in the corners of the room, dark figures that seemed to be watching her, waiting for her to fall. The pain was unbearable, a searing agony that pulsed through her body with every heartbeat. She could feel her strength slipping away, could feel herself being pulled into the darkness. But she couldn't escape the voices, couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. And then, in the midst of the chaos, she saw it, a figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was tall and shadowy, its face hidden in darkness. But she could feel its eyes on her, could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on her chest. It didn't speak, didn't move, but she knew it was there for her. Panic surged through Emily as she tried to move, tried to escape the figure's gaze. But her body wouldn't respond, wouldn't obey her commands. She was trapped, helpless, as the figure loomed closer, its shadowy form filling her vision. And then, just as she thought she would be consumed by the darkness, the figure leaned in, its voice a cold whisper in her ear. "You belong to us now." When Emily awoke, she was in a different room. The sterile white walls of the ICU were a stark contrast to the nightmare she had just experienced. She could hear the steady beeping of the machines, could feel the cool sheets beneath her. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. She could still feel the pain, could still hear the echoes of the voices that had haunted her. The figure's words replayed in her mind, a chilling reminder of the terror she had faced. But more than that, she felt different. Changed. As if something had followed her back from the darkness, something that was now a part of her. The doctors told her she was lucky to be alive, that she had lost a lot of blood but had pulled through. They spoke of recovery, of getting back to normal. But Emily knew that nothing would ever be normal again. The figure, the voices, they had left a mark on her, a mark that she could feel deep in her soul. As she lay in the hospital bed, staring up at the ceiling, she knew that her battle was far from over. The horror she had faced was not just a product of her mind, it was real, and it was still with her. And as the days turned into weeks, and she began to regain her strength, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still watching her, waiting for the moment when she would be vulnerable again. Because deep down, she knew that she hadn't escaped. She had only postponed the inevitable. The darkness was still there, lurking just out of sight, ready to claim her the moment she let her guard down. And as she lay in bed, the shadowy figure's words echoed in her mind, a haunting reminder of the terror that awaited her. Emily was eventually discharged from the hospital, but the terror she experienced never left her. She returned to her job at St. Mary's, determined to move on, but something had changed. The once familiar halls of the hospital now seemed darker, more oppressive. The sterile white walls felt like they were closing in on her, and the constant hum of activity was a relentless assault on her senses. The shadows that she had seen in her nightmare were still there, lurking in the corners of her vision. She would catch glimpses of them out of the corner of her eye, dark shapes that seemed to move when she wasn't looking. The figure that had spoken to her in the ICU was always in the back of her mind, a constant presence that filled her with dread. Her condition continued to worsen, the pain becoming more frequent and intense. The bleeding returned, soaking through her clothes no matter how many precautions she took. She started to avoid her colleagues, not wanting them to see the fear in her eyes, not wanting them to know that she was losing her grip on reality. But the worst part was the dreams. Every night, Emily would relive the horror she had faced in the hospital. The voices, the pain, the shadowy figure, they were all there, waiting for her as soon as she closed her eyes. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart racing, unable to shake the feeling that the figure was still watching her. She knew she couldn't go on like this, but she didn't know how to escape. The terror had become a part of her, a constant presence that she couldn't shake. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Emily began to fear that the darkness would eventually consume her. Emily's story is a chilling reminder of the horrors that can lie hidden beneath the surface. Her battle with adenomyosis was more than just a physical struggle, it was a psychological one as well, one that pushed her to the brink of madness. The pain, the fear, the relentless terror, they were all part of a nightmare that she couldn't escape. And as she continues to fight her condition, Emily knows that the darkness is still there, waiting for the moment when she is at her weakest. The shadowy figure, the voices, they are all part of a nightmare that never truly ends. And for Emily, the horror is just beginning. Days passed, and Emily's physical wounds began to heal. The doctors spoke of recovery and rehabilitation, but for Emily, the psychological scars ran much deeper. The shadows that had plagued her during her stay in the ICU continued to loom over her, a constant, unsettling presence. She could still hear the whispers, the accusations, and the haunting voice of the shadowy figure that had appeared in her nightmares. Though the hospital staff reassured her that everything was under control, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The figure from her nightmares seemed to have followed her back from the darkness, a silent observer lurking in the periphery of her vision. She would catch glimpses of it in the corners of rooms, in the reflections of windows, but whenever she tried to focus on it, it vanished. Emily's nights were plagued by vivid and disturbing dreams. She would wake up in cold sweats, her heart racing, only to find herself alone in her hospital room. The shadowy figure would be there, just out of reach, its voice echoing through her mind, taunting her with its cryptic messages. "You can never escape," it whispered. "You are forever bound to the darkness." Reluctantly, Emily returned to work at St. Mary's Hospital after her discharge. The return to her previous routine was fraught with anxiety. The once familiar halls now seemed alien and hostile, their brightness mocking the darkness that had claimed her. She attempted to resume her duties with a semblance of normalcy, but her condition continued to deteriorate. The pain, though managed with medication, was a constant reminder of her vulnerability. The bleeding, which had briefly subsided, returned with a vengeance, making it increasingly difficult for Emily to maintain her composure. The psychological strain of her condition only added to her physical suffering. The shadows that had haunted her dreams began to manifest in her waking hours. She saw dark figures flitting across the walls, felt cold drafts in closed rooms, and heard faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Her colleagues noticed the change in her demeanor but were unable to help, as Emily's fear was too deeply ingrained for them to understand. One evening, as Emily worked late in the hospital, the intensity of her symptoms reached a new peak. The pain was excruciating, a relentless torment that left her barely able to function. She had hoped for a quiet night, but the pressure of the hospital's constant activity seemed to amplify her suffering. In the dim light of the empty corridors, Emily saw the shadows grow darker, more menacing. The voices that had been mere whispers before were now shouting, their words a cacophony of dread and despair. The figure from her nightmares seemed to be drawing closer, its presence a tangible weight that pressed down on her chest. Emily struggled to maintain her focus as she carried out her duties. Her hands shook uncontrollably, and her vision blurred with each step she took. She tried to ignore the growing fear, telling herself that it was all in her head, but the intensity of the shadows and voices made it impossible to dismiss. Desperate for relief, Emily sought solace in the staff break room, hoping the isolation would calm her nerves. But as she sat alone, the room seemed to close in around her. The walls appeared to pulse with an eerie rhythm, and the shadows danced in the corners of her vision. The figure materialized before her, its dark form looming over her as the whispers grew louder. "You can't hide," it said, its voice a chilling, guttural rasp. "You belong to us." Emily's mental and physical health reached a breaking point. The relentless pain, the unending nightmares, and the suffocating presence of the shadowy figure had pushed her to the edge. She knew she couldn't continue working under these conditions, but the fear of seeking help made her hesitate. One fateful night, the pressure became unbearable. As she navigated the dimly lit corridors, the figure seemed to follow her, its presence more oppressive than ever. The whispers turned into a cacophony of screams, each one accusing her of weakness and failure. The shadows seemed to reach out, clawing at her sanity. Unable to bear it any longer, Emily collapsed in the middle of the corridor, her body shaking with fear and pain. Her colleagues rushed to her aid, their concern evident as they tried to stabilize her. But the terror Emily felt was beyond their understanding. She could no longer distinguish between reality and the nightmarish visions that tormented her. Emily was admitted to the psychiatric ward, where she was given a new regimen of medication and therapy to manage her condition. The sterile environment of the ward was a stark contrast to the bustling activity of the main hospital, but it offered no respite from the darkness that plagued her. The shadows that had once been a mere figment of her imagination were now a constant presence. Emily could see them moving in the corners of her vision, their forms shifting and twisting as if they were alive. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling her mind with their chilling messages. Therapy sessions offered little relief. The therapists struggled to understand the depth of Emily's fear, their attempts to comfort her falling short. The figure's voice continued to haunt her, a relentless reminder of the darkness that seemed to have become a part of her very being. As the days turned into weeks, Emily's grip on reality grew tenuous. The boundaries between the real world and her nightmares blurred, leaving her trapped in a perpetual state of dread. She could no longer tell if the shadows she saw were real or a product of her fractured mind. One night, Emily experienced a particularly vivid nightmare. In her dream, she found herself in a vast, dark void, the shadows swirling around her like living entities. The figure that had tormented her throughout her ordeal stood before her, its form more defined than ever. "You cannot escape," it intoned, its voice echoing through the darkness. "You are ours." Emily felt a surge of defiance as she confronted the figure. Despite the overwhelming fear, she fought back, determined to reclaim control over her own mind. The struggle was intense, the darkness closing in as the figure loomed closer. In a final, desperate act of will, Emily shouted, "I am not yours. I will not be controlled by you." As she cried out, the darkness seemed to recede, the shadows pulling back as if repelled by her resolve. The figure's form flickered and wavered, its presence weakening with each word she spoke. When Emily awoke, she was still in the psychiatric ward, but something had changed. The shadows and whispers were no longer as pervasive, their influence diminished, but not entirely gone. The battle she had fought in her dreams had left her physically and emotionally exhausted, but it had also given her a newfound strength. The journey to recovery was long and fraught with challenges. Emily continued to face physical pain and psychological torment, but she had taken the first steps toward reclaiming her life. The figure and its whispers were still present, but their power over her had been weakened. As she continues her recovery, Emily remains vigilant, knowing that the darkness is still there, lurking just out of sight. Her fight is far from over, but she faces it with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to overcome the nightmare that has defined her life. The horror of Emily's experience may never truly end, but her courage in the face of relentless fear is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Her story is a chilling echo of the darkness that can lie hidden beneath the surface, a reminder that sometimes the true horrors are the ones we carry within ourselves.